Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read aloud of Can You Forgive Her, where we are up to chapter 12, which starts first with an inscription from Shakespeare, an epitaph from Shakespeare, and then moves on straight into the main action. We left the occupants of the castle and Ark buried in sleep. Once or twice in the course of the night, it is true, Deerslayer or the Delaware arose and looked out upon the tranquil lake, when, finding all safe, each returned to his pallet and slept like a man who was not easily deprived of his natural rest. They sleep like babies. They don't worry all night. At the first sign of the dawn, the former, that is Deerslayer, arose, however, and made his personal arrangements for the day. That is our author's circumlocution for pee and poop. However, and made his personal arrangements for the day, though his companion, whose nights had not been tranquil or without disturbance of late, continued on his blanket until the sun had fairly risen. Judith, too, was later than common that morning, for the earlier hours of the night had brought her little of either refreshment or sleep. But ere the sun had shown himself over the eastern hills, these two were up and afoot, even the tardy in that region seldom remaining on their pallets after the appearance of the great luminary. Once again, we have to pardon our author; he's a bit of a windbag, but interesting to note that it's not common custom on the lakes for anyone to be in bed at sunrise. They're still up before sunrise, even though they're later than Deerslayer. Chingachgook, that's the Delaware, was in the act of arranging his forest toilet. Peeing and pooping is what our author means. When Deerslayer entered the cabin cabin of the Ark, and threw him a few coarse but light summer vestments that belonged to Hutter. Because it's not going to do anybody any good for Chingachgook to be seen in his native garb. Judith hath given me these for your use, chief, said the latter, as he cast a jacket and trousers at the feet of the Indian. For it is all prudence again, and caution to be seen in your war dress and paint. Wash off all them fiery streaks from your cheeks, put on those garments, and here is this hat, such as it is, that will give you an awful uncivilized sort of civilization, as the missionaries call it. Remember that Hist is at hand, and what we do for the maiden must be done while we are doing for others. I know it's agin your gifts and your nature to wear clothes unless they are cut and carried in the red man's fashion, but make a virtue of necessity and put these on at once, even if they do rise a little in your throat. Chingachgook, or the serpent, he's going to be called the serpent for most of the chapter, but eyed the vestments with strong disgust. But he saw the usefulness of the disguise, if not its absolute necessity. Should the Iroquois discover a red man in or about the castle, it might, indeed, place them on more on their guard and give their suspicions a direction towards the female captive. Anything was better than that. A failure, as it regarded his betrothed, and after turning the different garments round and round, examining them with a species of grave irony, affecting to draw them on in a way that defeated itself, and otherwise manifesting a reluctance of young savage to confine his limbs to the unusual appliances of civilized life, the chief submitted to the directions of his companion and finally stood forth, so far as the eye could detect, a red man in color alone. And notice, we're told that he affects to put the garments on the wrong way. So it's possible that there's a little bit of clowning going on here, even though it's a very serious moment. They're on a serious mission. It's possible that the serpent is having a little bit of fun, that maybe he knows how to put these things on. Little was to be apprehended from this last peculiarity, however, the distance from the shore and the want of glasses, that is, spyglasses or telescopes, binoculars, preventing any very close scrutiny, and Deerslayer himself, though of a brighter and fresher tint, had a countenance that was burned by the sun to a hue scarcely less red than that of his Mohican companion. The awkwardness of the Delaware in his new attire caused his friend to smile more than once that day, but he carefully abstained from the use of any of those jokes which would have bandied among white men on such an occasion. The habits of a chief, the dignity of a warrior on his first path, and the gravity of the circumstances in which they were placed, are uniting to render such levity out of season. It's important to remember that Chingachgook is a chief. He's young. He's on his first warpath, but he's a person of dignity. You don't poke fun at him. The meeting at the morning meal of the three islanders, if we may use the term, was silent and grave and thoughtful. Judith showed by her looks that she had passed on a quiet night, while the two men had the future before them, with its unseen and unknown events. A few words of courtesy passed between Deerslayer and the girl in the course of the breakfast, but no allusion was made to their situation. At length Judith, whose heart was full, and whose novel feelings disposed her to entertain sentiments more gentle and tender than common, introduced the subject, and this in a way to show how much of her thoughts it had occupied in the course of last sleepless night. "It would be dreadful, Deerslayer," the girl abruptly exclaimed, "should anything serious befall my father and Hetty. We cannot remain quietly here and leave them in the hands of the Iroquois without bethinking of some means of serving them." "I'm ready, Judith, to serve them and all others who are in trouble, could the way to do it be pointed out. It's no trifling matter to fall into Redskins' hand when men is set out on an errand that which took Hunter and Hetty ashore. And I know as well as another, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy in such a strait, much less them with whom I've journeyed and eat and slept. Have you any scheme that you would like to have the Serpent and I endeavor to carry out?" "I know of no other means to release the prisoners than by bribing the Iroquois." Bless Judith. She's beautiful, and she can be flighty, but she has a head on her shoulders. Of course, the straightway's way is to bribe the kidnappers. They are not proof against such presents, and we might offer enough, perhaps, to make them think it better to carry away what to them will be rich gifts than to carry away 2 poor prisoners, if, indeed, they should carry them away at all, because keep in mind, they could also be killed. This is well enough, Judith. Yes, it's well enough. If the enemy is to be bought, and we can find articles to make the purchase with, your father has a convenient lodge, and it is most cunningly placed, though it doesn't seem overstocked with riches that will be likely to buy his ransom. There's the piece he calls killdeer, might count for something. And I understand there's a keg of powder about, which might be make weight certain, and yet 2 able-bodied men are not to be bought for a trifle. Besides what?" demanded Judith impatiently, observing that the other hesitated to proceed, probably from a reluctance to distress her. "Why, Judith, the Frenchers offer bounties as well as our own side, and the price of 2 scalps would purchase a keg of powder and a rifle." Little thing, our author passes over it quickly, but remember, that's the kind of money that was usually involved. 2 scalps will buy you a keg of powder and a rifle. Though I'll not say one of the latter altogether as good as killdeer there, which your father vaunts as uncommon and unequalled like. But fair powder, and pretty certain rifle, then the red men are not the expertest on the firearms, and don't always know the difference betwixt that which is real and that which is seeming real." "This is horrible," muttered the girl, struck by the homely manner in which her companion was accustomed to state his facts. "But you overlook my own clothes, Deerslayer, and they, I think, might go far with the women of the Iroquois." "Oh, no doubt they would, Judith," returned the other, looking at her keenly, as if he would ascertain whether she was really capable of making such a sacrifice. It hasn't seemed like the sort of thing that Judith would be willing to do. "But are you certain, girl, that you would find your own heart to part with your finery for such a purpose? Many is the man who has thought he was valiant till danger stared him in the face. I've known them too that consented they would kind and ready to give all they had to the poor, when they've been listening to other people's hard-heartedness, but whose fists have clenched as tight as the river's hickory when it came to downright offerings of their own. Besides, Judith, you're handsome, uncommon in that way, one might observe, and do no harm to the truth, and that they have beauty like to have that which will adorn it. Are you certain you could find it in your heart to part with your own finery?" The soothing allusions to the personal charms of the girl was well timed, to counteract the effect produced by the distrust that the young man expressed of Judith's devotion to her filial duties. Had another said as much as Deerslayer, the compliment would probably have been overlooked, in indignation awakened by the doubts, but even the unpolished sincerity that so often made the simple-hearted hunter bare his thoughts had a charm for the girl, and while she colored, and for an instant her eye flashed fire, she could not find it in her heart to be really angry with one whose very soul seemed truth and manly kindness. Look her reproaches she did, but conquering the desire to retort, she succeeded in answering in a mild and friendly manner. "You must keep all your favorable opinions of Delaware girls, Deerslayer, if you seriously think thus of one who's of your own color," she said, affecting to laugh. "But try me. If you find that I regret either ribbon or feather, silk or muslin, then you may think what you please of my heart, and say what you think." "That's justice. The rarest thing to find on earth is a truly just man. So says Tamenund, the wisest prophet of the Delawares, so all must think to have occasion to see, and talk, and act amongst mankind." No one knows who the wisest prophet of the Delawares is. Natty Bumppo has been, his entire frame of reference, as you see in this chapter, is entirely Native American. It's not white at all. He knows what whites are like. but he's not like them, and he wasn't raised to think that way. I love a just man. Serpent. His eyes are never covered with darkness towards his enemies, while they are all sunshine and brightness towards his friends. He uses the reason that God gave him, and he uses it with a feeling of his being ordered to look at, and to consider things as they are, not as he wants them to be. It's easy enough to find them who call themselves just, but it's wonderfully uncommon to find them that are the very thing, in fact. How often I have seen Indians, gal, who believe they were looking at into the matter agreeable to the will of the Great Spirit, when in truth they were only striving to act up their own will and pleasure, and this half of the time with a temptation to go wrong, that could be no more seen by themselves than the stream that runs in the next valley can be seen by us through yonder mountain, though any looker-on might have discovered it plainly, as he can be discovered the parch on which that's swimming around this hut. Very true, Deerslayer. I'm not sure of that. It was borderline genuine frontier gibberish, but it's moral pronouncements, which people in now looking back on these books don't associate them with, but they're full of moral pronouncements, full of them. Very true, Deerslayer, rejoined Judith, losing every trace of displeasure in a bright smile. Very true, and I hope to see you act on this love of justice in all matters in which I am concerned. Above all, I hope you will judge for yourself, and not believe every evil story that a prattling idler like Hurry Harry may have to tell, that goes to touch the good name of any young woman who may not happen to have the same opinions of his face and person that blustering gallant has of himself. Doth me lady protest too much? Hurry Harry's ideas do not pass for gospel with me, Judith. And even worse that he may have eyes and ears, returned the other gravely. Enough of this, exclaimed Judith, with flashing eye and a flush that mounted to her temples. The more of my father and his ransom. 'Tis as you say, Deerslayer, the Indians will not be likely to give up their prisoners without a heavier bribe than my clothes can offer, and my father's rifle and powder. But there is the chest. A great, enormous, ornate chest, heavy, full. Aye, there's the chest, as you say, Judith, and when the question's got to be between a secret and a scalp, I should think most men would prefer keeping the last. Did your father ever give you any downright command concerning the chest? Never. He has always appeared to think its locks and its steel bands and its strength its protection. 'Tis a rare chest, altogether a curious build, returned Deerslayer, rising and approaching the thing in question, on which he seated himself, with a view to examine it with greater ease. Chingachgook, this is no wood that comes out of any forest that you or I ever trailed through. 'Tisn't the black walnut, and yet 'tis quite as comely, if not more so. Did the smoke and the treatment give it fair play? In other words, it's been handled roughly, but it's still a beautiful wood. The Delaware drew near, felt the wood, examined its grain, endeavored to indent its surface with a nail, and passed his hand curiously over the steel bands, the heavy padlocks, and the other novel peculiarities of the massive box. No, nothing like it grows in these regions, resumed Deerslayer. I've seen all the oaks, both maples and elms and basswood, all the walnuts and butternuts, and every tree that has substance and color wrought into some form or other, but never before have I seen a wood such as this. Judith, the chest itself would buy your father's freedom, or Iroquois curiosity isn't as strong as Redskin curiosity in general, especially in the matter of woods. So maybe they could use the chest itself, but what's in it? What's inside it? This, as we have noted before, our author is an old showman. He is putting Shakespeare in every epitaph. He is doing his best to add all sorts of sermons on the mount. He is doing his best to seem like literature for the quality. But he's an old showman. If he has anything to reveal, he's going to take his sweet time revealing it, all the while making you want more and more for the revelation. You got to pay attention to the subtle ways that he does it, because subtlety is not a word associated with this author. Wait, where were we here? Well, I did my own bit of sermonizing. The purchase might be cheaper made, perhaps, Deerslayer. The chest is full, and it would be better to part with half than with the whole. Besides, father, I know not why, but father values the chest highly. He would seem to prize what it holds more than the chest itself, judging by the manner in which he treats the outside and secures the inside. Here are 3 locks, Judith. Is there no key? I've never seen one, and yet the key must be here, since Hetty told me she has often seen inside the chest. Keys no more lie in the air or float in the water than humans, gal. If there is a key, there must be a place in which it is kept. That is true, and it might not be difficult to find, did we dare to search. Well, this is for you, Judith. It's altogether for you. The chest is yourn and your father's, and Hutter is your father, and not mine. Curiosity is a woman's and not a man's failing, and there you've got all the reason before you. If the chest has articles for ransom, it seems to me they would be wisely used in redeeming their owner's life, and even in saving his scalp. But that is a matter for your judgment, and not for ourn. When the lawful owner is a trap or a buck or a canoe isn't present, his next of kin become his representative. By all the laws of the woods, we therefore leave you to say whether the chest shall be opened or not. I hope you do not believe that I can hesitate when my father's life is in danger, Deerslayer. Why, it's pretty much putting a scolding against tears and mourning, and it's not over-reasonable to foretell that old Tom may find fault with you with what you've done when he sees himself once more in his hut here. There's nothing unusual in men's falling out with what has been done for their own good. I dare say that even the moon would seem a different thing from what it does now, could we look at it from the other side. You're quite the philosopher, aren't you, Natty Bumppo? Deerslayer, if we can find the key, I will authorize you to open the chest and to take such things from it as you think may buy my father's ransom. We'll first find the key, gal. We'll talk of the rest afterwards. Serpent, you've got eyes like a fly and a judgment that's seldom out. Can you help us by calculating where Floating Tom would be apt to keep the keys of a chest he holds as private as this? The Delaware had taken no part in the discourse until he was thus directly appealed to, when he quitted the chest, which had continued to attract his attention, and cast about him for the place in which they were likely to be concealed in such circumstances. As Judith and Deerslayer were not idle the while, the whole three were soon engaged in an anxious and spirited search. As it was certain that the desired key was not to be found in any of the common drawers or closets, of which there were several in the building, none looked there, but all turned their inquiries to those places that struck them as ingenious hiding-places, and more likely to be used for such a purpose. In this manner, the outer room was thoroughly but fruitlessly examined, when they entered the sleeping apartments of Hutter. This part of the rude building was better furnished than the rest of the structure, containing several articles that had especially devoted to the service of his deceased wife of the owner. But as Judith had all the rest of the keys, it was soon rummaged without bringing to light the particular key desired. They now entered the bedroom of the daughters. Chingachgook was immediately struck with the contrast between the articles and the arrangement on that side of the room that might be called Judith's, and that which properly belonged to Hetty, her sister. A slight exclamation escaped him, and pointing in each direction, he alluded to the fact in a low voice, speaking to his friend in the Delaware tongue. As you think, Serpent, answered Deerslayer, whose remarks we always translated to English, preserving as much as possible the peculiar phraseology and manner of the man. So they're not speaking in English. They don't want Judith to know what they're saying. 'Tis just so, as anyone may see, and 'tis all founded in nature. One sister loves finery, the other say overmuch. Some say overmuch, while the other is as meek and lowly as God ever created goodness and truth. Yet after all, I dare say that Judith has her virtues, and Hetty her failings. So they're looking at the daughter's room, which they share, and one side is all pretty and finery, and the other is plain. And the feeble mind has seen the chest open, inquired Chingachgook, curiosity in his glance. He doesn't think much of the sister. Certain, that much I've heard from her own lips, and for that matter, so have you. Seems her father doesn't misgive her discretion, though he does that of his eldest daughter. Then the key is hid only from the wild rose? For so Chingachgook had begun gallantly to term Judith in his private discourse with his friend. That's it. That's just it. One he trusts and the other he doesn't. There's the red and white in that, Serpent. All tribes and nations agreeing in trust some and refusing to trust others. It depends on character and judgment. Where could the key be put, so little likely to be found by the wild rose, as among coarse clothes? In other words, hide the key on her sister's side of the room. Deerslayer started, and turning to his friend with admiration expressed in every lineament of his face, he fairly laughed, in his silent but hearty manner, at the ingenuity and readiness of the conjecture. Your name's well bestowed, Serpent. Indeed, 'tis well bestowed. Sure enough, where would a lover of finery be so little likely to search as among the garments as coarse and seemly as those of poor Hetty? I dare say Judith's delicate fingers haven't touched a bit of cloth as rough and uncomely as that petticoat now, since she first made acquaintance with the officers. Yet who knows? The key may be as likely to be on the same peg as any other. Take down the garment, Delaware, and let us see if you really are a prophet. Chingachgook did as he desired, but no key was found. A coarse pocket, apparently empty, hung on the adjoining peg, and this was next examined. But this time the attention of Judith was called in that direction, and she spoke hurriedly, like one who wished to be to save unnecessary trouble. "These are only the clothes of poor Hetty, dear simple girl," she said. "Nothing we seek will be likely to be here." The words were hardly out of the handsome mouth of the speaker when Chingachgook drew the desired key from the pocket. Judith was too quick of apprehension not to understand the reason the hiding place, so simple and exposed, had been used. The blood rushed to her face, as much with resentment, perhaps, as with shame, and she bit her lip, though she continued silent. Deerslayer and his friend now discovered the delicacy of men of native refinement, neither smiling nor even a brief glance betraying how completely he understood the motives and ingenuity of this clever artifice. The former, who had taken the key from the Indian, led the way into the adjoining room, and applying it to a lock, ascertained that the right instrument had actually been found. There were 3 padlocks, each of which, however, was easily opened with this single key. Deerslayer removed them all, loosening the hasps, raised the lid a little to make certain that it was loose, and then he drew back from the chest several feet, signing to his friend to follow. They may have unlocked it, but they don't want to open it, with the owner's daughter standing right there. "This is a family chest, Judith," he said, "and 'tis like to hold family secrets. The serpent and I will go into the ark and look to our canoes and paddles and oars, while you can examine it by yourself and find out whether anything that will be make-weight in a ransom is or is not among the articles. When you've got through, give us a call, and we'll all sit in council together, touching the value of the articles." "Stop, Deerslayer," exclaimed the girl as he was about to withdraw. "Not a single thing will I touch. I will not even raise the lid unless you are present. Father and Hetty have seen fit to keep the inside of the chest secret from me, and I am much too proud to pry into their hidden treasures, unless it were for their own good. But on no account will I open the chest alone. Stay with me, then. I want witnesses of what I do." So even in this emergency, she still rancored with the fact that her father would often show her the inside of this chest to her sister, but never to her. That still bothers her. "I rather think, Serpent, that the girl is right," said Natty Bumppo. "Confidence and reliance beget security, but suspicion is like to make us all wary. Judith has a right to ask to be present, and should the chest hold any of Master Hutter's secrets, they will fall into the keeping of 2 close-mouthed young men, as are likely to be found. We will stay with you, Judith, but first let us take a look at the lake and shore, for the chest will not be emptied in a minute. They've got work in front of them, and they don't want to be caught by surprise. The lake should be clean." The 2 men now went to the platform, and Deerslayer swept the shore with the glass, while the Indian gravely turned his eye on the water and the woods, in quest of any sign that might betray the machinations of their enemies. Nothing was visible, and assured of their temporary security, the 3 collected around the chest again with the avowed object of opening it. Judith had held the chest and its unknown contents in a species of reverence as long as she could remember. Neither her father nor her mother ever mentioned it in her presence, and there appeared to be a silent convention that in naming the different objects and occasionally stood near it, or even lay it on its lid, care should be had to avoid any allusion to the chest itself. Habit rendered this so easy, and so much a matter of course, that it was only quite recently that the girl had begun even to muse on the singularity of the circumstance. But there had never been sufficient intimacy between Hutter and his eldest daughter to invite confidence. At times he was kind, but in general, with her more especially, he was stern and morose. Least of all had his authority been exercised in the way to embolden his child to venture into the liberty she was about to take, which may, with many misgivings of the consequences, although the liberty proceeded from a desire to serve himself. Then Judith was not altogether free from a little superstition on the subject of this chest, which has stood a sort of tabooed relic before her eyes from childhood to the present hour. Nonetheless, the time had come when it would seem that this mystery was to be explained, and that under circumstances, too, which left her very little choice in the matter. Finding that both her companions were watching her movements in grave silence, Judith placed a hand on the lid and endeavored to raise it. Her strength, however, was insufficient, and it appeared to the girl, who was fully aware of all the fastenings were removed, that she was resisted in an unhallowed attempt by some supernatural power. No, it's not that it's a supernatural power. It's that it's a big, heavy chest. You're just not strong enough to lift the lid. "I cannot raise the lid, Deerslayer," she said. "Had we not better give up the attempt and find some other means of releasing the prisoners?" "Not so, Judith, not so, gal. No means are certain as easy as a good bribe," answered the other. "As far as the lid, 'tis held by nothing but its own weight, which is prodigious of so small a piece of wood loaded with iron the way it is. As Deerslayer spoke, he applied his own strength to the effort and succeeded in raising the lid against the timbers of the house, where he took care to secure it by a sufficient prop. Judith fairly trembled as she cast her first glance in the interior. She felt a temporary relief in discovering that a piece of canvas that was carefully tucked in around the edges effectively concealed all beneath it. The chest was apparently well stored. However, the canvas lying within an inch of the lid. So everything that's inside is covered by a canvas, which, having traveled with a chest, I can tell you is a great idea. Pack it to a fare thee well, but cover it when you're done and tuck it down deep on the sides. But the point is that the canvas is right under the lid, so the chest is completely full. Here's a full cargo, said Deerslayer, eyeing the arrangement, and we needs to get to work leisurely and at our ease. Serpent, bring some stools while I spread the blanket on the floor, then we'll begin work orderly and in comfort. The Delaware complied. Deerslayer civilly placed a stool for Judith, took one for himself, and commenced the removal of the canvas covering. This was done deliberately, and in as cautious a manner as if they had believed that the fabrics of delicate construction lay hidden beneath. When the canvas was removed, the first article that came to view were some of the habiliments of the male sex. Clothes, in other words. These were fine material, and according to the fashions of the age, were gay in color and rich in ornament. One coat, in particular, was full scarlet, and had buttonholes worked in gold thread. Still, it was not military, but was part of the attire of a civilian of condition, at a period when social rank was rigidly respected in dress. Chingachgook could not refrain from an exclamation of pleasure as soon as the Deerslayer opened this coat and held it up for view. Notwithstanding all his trained self-command, the splendor of the vestment was too much for the philosophy of an Indian. Deerslayer turned quickly, and he regarded his friend with a momentary displeasure, as this burst of weakness escaped him. And then he soliloquized, as was his practice whenever any strong feeling suddenly got the ascendancy. Yeah, to put it mildly, or this book would be a lot shorter. 'Tis his gift, yes, 'tis the gift of the Redskins to love finery, and he is not to be blamed. This is an extraordinary garment, too, and extraordinary things get up by extraordinary feelings. I think this will do, Judith, for the Indian heart is hardly to be found in all America that can withstand the colors that these glitter and gleam like. If this coat has ever made for your father, you've come honestly by the taste of finery, that you have. That coat was never made for father, answered the girl, quickly. It's much too long, and while father is short and square. It's also, you're supposed to infer, of the fashion of an earlier age. Cloth was plenty, if it was, and glitter cheap, answered the Deerslayer, in his silent, joyous laugh. Serpent, this garment was made for a man of your size. I should like to see it on your shoulders. Chingachgook, nothing loath, submitted to the trial, throwing aside the coarse and threadbare jacket of Hutter to deck his person in the coat that was originally intended for a gentleman. The transformation was ludicrous, but as men are seldom struck with the incongruities of their own appearance in any more than that of their conduct, the Delaware studied this change in common glass, by which Hutter was in the habit of shaving, with grave interest. At that moment he thought of Hist, and he owed it to his truth to say, though it may be militate a little against the stern character of the warrior to own it, that he wished he could be seen by her in his present improved aspect. Off with it, Serpent, off with it, resumed the inflexible Deerslayer. Such garments as little become you as they would become me. Your gifts are for paint, and hawk's feathers, and blankets, and wampum, and mine are for doublets of skins, tough leggings, and serviceable moccasins. I say moccasins, Judith, for though white, living as I do in the woods, it's necessary to take some of the practices of the woods, for comfort's sake, and cheapness. I see no reason, Deerslayer, why one man may not wear a scarlet coat as well as another, resumed the girl. I wish I could see you in this handsome garment. See me in a coat fit for a lord? Well, Judith, if you wait till that day, you'll wait to see me go beyond reason and memory. No, gal, my gifts are my gifts, and I'll live and die in 'em, though I never bring down another deer or spear another salmon. What have I done that you should wish to see me in such a flaunting coat, Judith? Because I think, Deerslayer, that the false-tongued and false-hearted young gallants of the garrison ought not alone to appear in fine feathers, but that truth and honesty have their claims to be honored and exalted as well. That's actually a very nice compliment. She is surrounded by what did she call them? The false-tongued and false-hearted young gallants. She's beautiful, so she's surrounded by them all the time. But she's starting to develop a preference for a far more honest man, who they would disdain. And what exaltation The reader will have remarked that Deerslayer had not very critically studied his dictionary. What exaltification! What would it be to me, Judith, to be bedizened and bescarleted like a Mingo chief that has just got his presents up from Quebec? No, no. I am well as I am, and if not, I can be no better. Lay the coat down on the blanket, Sarpent, and let us look farther into the chest. The tempting garment, one surely that was never intended for Hutter, was laid aside, and the examination proceeded. The male attire, all of which corresponded with the coat of quality, was soon exhausted, and then succeeded female. A beautiful dress of brocade, a little worse from negligent treatment, followed, and in this time an open exclamation of delight escaped the lips of Judith. Much as the girl had been addicted to dress, and favorable as had been her opportunities for seeing some little pretensions in that way among the wives of the different commanders, the different commandants, and other ladies of the forts, never before had she beheld such a tissue. The tints equal those of the now unexpected place before her eyes. Her rapture was almost childish. Nor would she allow the inquiry to proceed until she had attired her person in a robe so unsuited to her habits and her abode. With this end, she withdrew into her own room, where, with hands practised in such offices, she soon got rid of her own great neat gown of linen, and stood forth in the gay tints of the brocade. The dress happened to fit the fine, full person of Judith, and certainly it never adorned a being better qualified by nature's gifts to credit it than the really rich hues and fine textures. Now we understand a little about why Deerslayer thought it would take a long time to look at what's in this chest. Well, if you're going to play with everything you take out of it, of course it's going to take you longer. When she returned, both Deerslayer and Chingachgook, who had passed the brief time in her absence in taking a second look at the male garments, instead of looking in the chest, arose in surprise, each permitting an exclamation of wonder and pleasure to escape him in a way so unequivocal as to add new luster to the eyes of Judith by flushing her cheeks with a glow of triumph. Affecting, however, not to notice the impression she had made, the girl seated herself with the stateliness of a queen, desiring that the chest might be looked into further. This is actually in the midst of a tense plot, in the midst of a tense sequence. This is a charming moment. Granted, you're pulling your hair out by modern narrative standards, you're pulling your hair out because in this circumstance, realistically, all three of them would pull out all the stuff in the chest before they tried on any clothes. They would get to the bottom of everything and see it. But it's still a charming moment. These three young people trying on fancy clothes and pleasing each other. I don't know a better way to treat the Mingos, gal, cried Deerslayer, than to send them ashore as you be, and to tell them that as a queen has arrived among them. They'll give up old Hutter and Harry and Hetty, too, at such a spectacle. I thought your tongue too honest to flatter, Deerslayer, responded the girl, gratified at the admiration, more than she would have cared to own. One of the chief reasons of my respect was your love for the truth. And 'tis truth and solemn truth, Judith, and nothing else. Never did eyes of mine gaze on so glorious-looking a creature as you be yourself at this very moment. I've seen beauties in my time, too, both red and white, and them that was renowned and talked of far and near, but never did I beheld one that could hold a comparison with what you are at this blessed instant, Judith, never. The glance of delight which the girl bestowed on the frank-speaking Hunter in no degree lessened the effect of her charms, and as the humid eyes blended with that look of sensibility, perhaps Judith never appeared to be more truly lovely than at what that young man had called this blessed instant. He shook his head, held it suspended a moment over the open chest like one in doubt, and then proceeded with the examination. Several of the minor articles of female dress came next, all of the quality to correspond with the gown. These were laid out at Judith's feet in silence, as if she had a natural claim to their possession. One or two, such as gloves and laces, the girl caught up and appended to her already rich attire, in affected playfulness, but with the real design of decorating her person as far as circumstances would allow. When these two remarkable suits, made male and female, might be termed, were removed, another canvas, covering separately the remainder of the articles in the part of the chest which was occupied. As soon as Deerslayer perceived this arrangement, he paused, doubtful of the propriety of proceeding any further. So there's layers of canvas. Again, very wise precaution. Every man has his secrets, I suppose, he said, and all men have a right to their enjoyment. We've got low enough in the chest, as my judgment, to answer our wants, and it seems to me that we should be well going no further, by letting Master Hutter have himself and his own feelings all that's beneath this cover. Do you mean, Deerslayer, to offer these clothes to the Iroquois as ransom? Demanded Judith. Certainly. What are we prying into another man's chest for but to serve its owner the best way we can? This coat alone would be apt to gain over the head of a chief of reptiles, And if his wife is or daughter that's daughter to you and me, should happen to be out with him, that would be that their gown would soften the hearts of any woman that is to be found between Albany and Montreal. I do not see that we want a larger stock in trade than them 2 articles. Oh, to you it may seem so, Deerslayer, returned the disappointed girl, but of what use is a dress like this to any Indian woman? She could not wear it amongst the branches of the trees. The dirt and smoke of the wigwam would soon soil it. And how would a pair of red arms appear thrust through these short lace sleeves? All very true, gal. You might go on to say it is altogether out of time and place and season in this region at all. What is it to us? The finery is treated so long as it answers our wishes. I do not see that your father can make any use of such clothes. It's lucky he has these things that are of no value to himself that may bear the high price with others. We can make no better trade for him than to offer these duds for his liberty. We'll throw them in with light frivolities and get hurry off in the bargain. So again, Deerslayer, he always claims to be a rough-hewn man of the forest, doesn't know anything about white civilized ways, likes to poke fun at civilization, but even he can tell that these clothing would not do her father any good. They're of a different era. That he would be laughed at if he wore them to ballroom. Then think, Deerslayer, that Thomas Hutter has no one in his family, no child, no daughter, to whom this dress may be thought becoming, and whom he could wish to see it in once in a while, even though it should be at long intervals, and only in playfulness? I understood you, Judith. Yes, I now understand your meaning, and I think I can say your wishes. That you are as glorious in that dress as the sun when it rises or sets in soft October day, I am ready to allow, and that you greatly become it is a good deal more certain than that it becomes you. There's gifts in clothes as well as in other things. Now, I do not think that a warrior on his first path ought to lay on the same awful paints as his chief that has had his virtue tried and knows from experience that he will not disgrace his pretensions. A little bit of a jab at Chingachgook. So it is with all of us, red or white. You think Thomas Hutter's daughter, that gown was made for a child of some governor or lady of high station, and it was intended to be worn among fine furniture and in rich company. In my eyes, Judith, a modest maid never looks more becoming than when becomingly clad, and nothing more suitable than out of character. Besides, gal, if there's a creature in the colony that can afford to do without finery and trust to her own good looks and sweet countenance, it's you. I'll take off the rubbish this instant, Deerslayer, cried the girl, springing to leave the room. I never do wish to see it on any human being again. So it is with all of them, Sarpent, said the other, turning to his friend and laughing as soon as the beauty had disappeared. They like finery, but they like nature charms most of all. I'm glad the gal has consented to lay aside her furbelows, howsoever, for it's again reason for one of her class to wear 'em, and when she's handsome enough, so I call it, so go alone. Hist would show uncommon likely, too, in such a gown, Delaware. Watawa is a redskin girl, Deerslayer, returned the Indian. Like the young of the pigeon, she is to be known by her own feathers. I should pass by without knowing her, were she dressed in such a skin. It's the wisest to be seen so clad that our friends need not ask us for our name. The wild rose is very pleasant, but she is no sweeter for so many colors. That's it. That's nature and true foundation for love and protection. When a man stops to pick a wild strawberry, he does not expect to find a melon, and when he wishes to gather a melon, he's disappointed if it prove to be a squash, though squashes be often brighter to the eye than melons. That's it, and it means stick to your gifts, and your gifts will stick to you. Now, that might seem, intervals like that from Deerslayer might seem like incredibly fake, starchy preaching, secular preaching, and it would be a mistake if you allow it to sound just like that, because these books were doing a lot to create a national character. And believe it or not, now, 200 years later, it's going to find it hard to believe, but the readers of these books eagerly ate up sentiments like that. Eagerly did. They eagerly ate it up. They loved the action sequences, don't get me wrong, and the humor, but they loved the philosophizing. The two men had now a little discussion together, touching on the propriety of penetrating any further into the chest of Hutter, when Judith appeared, divested of her robes and in her own simple linen frock again. So they still haven't looked in the chest. They're just standing there looking at it. Thank you, Judith, said Deerslayer, taking her kindly by the hand. For I know when a little again the natural cravings of women to lay aside so much finery as it might be in a lump. But you're more pleasing to the eyes you stand you be, than if you had a crown on your head and the jewels dangle be, than if you had a crown on your head and jewels dangling from your hair. The question now is, whither to lift this uncovering and see what might really be best bargain, when we can make for Mr. Hutter. For we must do as we think he would be willing to do, and as we stand here in his place. Judith looked very happy. Accustomed as she was to adulation, the humble homage of the Deerslayer had given her more true satisfaction than she had ever yet received from the tongue of man. He's just telling her the truth. He doesn't want anything. She's never heard that before. It was not the terms in which the admiration had been expressed, for they were simple enough, that produced so strong an impression, nor yet their novelty, or their warmth, or manner, nor were it any of the peculiarities that usually gave value to praise, but the unflinching truth of the speaker, that carried his words so directly to the heart of the listener. This is one of the great advantages of plain dealing and frankness. The habitual and wily flatterer may succeed until his practices recoil on himself, and, like other sweets, his ailments cloy by excess. But he who deals honestly, though he is often necessarily offends, possesses a power of praising that no quality of sincerity can bestow. That no quality but sincerity can bestow. Unlike the compliments that Judith has heard, the Deerslayer actually means it. Since his words go directly to the heart, finding their support in the understanding. Thus it was that Deerslayer and Judith, so soon and so deeply did that simple hunter impress those who knew him with a conviction of his unbending honesty, that all he uttered in commendation was as certain to please as all he uttered in the way of rebuke was as certain to rankle and excite enmity, where his character had not awakened a respect and affection, that in another sense rendered it painful. In afterlife, when the carrier of this untutored being brought him in contact with officers of rank and others entrusted with the care and interests of the state, this same influence was exerted on a wider field, even generals listening to his commendations with a glow of pleasure that is not always to be in the power of official supervisors to awaken. Perhaps Judith was the first individual of his own color who fairly submitted to this natural consequence of truth and fair dealing on the part of Deerslayer. She had actually pined for his praise, and she had now received it, and that in form which was most agreeable to her weakness and habits of thought. The result will appear in the course of this narrative. Oh, God. Well, our author is lovable. He's a windbag. He is pompous. He's very wealthy by this point, but he is lovable. If we knew all that the chest holds, Deerslayer, returned the girl, when she had a little recovered from the immediate effect produced by his commendations of her personal appearance, we could better determine the course on which we might take. That's not unreasonable, girl, though it's more pale-faced than redskin gift to be prying into other people's secrets. Notice? Almost never when Deerslayer talks about a comparison between white man and red man, almost never does the comparison work in white man's favor. Curiosity is natural, and it is expected in all human beings should have some failings. Whenever I've been at the garrison, I found that most in and about them had a longing to learn their neighbors' secrets. Yes, and sometimes fancy them when they couldn't find them out. That's the difference between an Indian gentleman and a white gentleman. The sergeant here would turn his head aside if he found himself unknowingly looking into the chief's wigwam, whereas in the settlements, while all pretend to be great people, most prove they've got betters by the manner in which they talk of their concerns. I'll be bound, Judith, you wouldn't get the serpent there to confess that there was another in the tribe so much greater than himself as to become the subject of his ideas, and employ his tongue in conversation with his movements, and ways and food, and all the other little matters that occupy a man when he's got to be employed with his greater duties. He who does this is but little better than a blackguard in the grain, and them that encourages him is pretty much of the same kidney. Let them wear coats as fine as they may, or what dye they please. Yes, indeed. I agree completely. Very wealthy people who do literally nothing but praise themselves all day long, and the jackals that praise them for the scraps of their wealth, are to be pitied and scorned. I agree completely. I'm so glad we don't see that in our own age, 200 years since. But this is not another man's wigwam. It belongs to my father, and the things in his are wanted in his service. That's true, gal, that's true, and it carries weight with it. Well, when all this is before us, we may indeed best judge which is to offer the ransom and what to withhold. Judith was not altogether so disinterested in her feelings as she affected to be. She remembered that the curiosity of Hetty had often been indulged in connection with the chest, while her own had been discarded, and she was not sorry to possess an opportunity of being placed on a level with her less gifted sister in this one particular. It appearing to be admitted all round that the inquiry into the concept of the chest ought to be renewed, Deerslayer proceeded to remove the second covering of canvas. The articles that lay uppermost, when the curtain was again raised on the secrets of the chest, were a pair of pistols, curiously inlaid with silver. Their value would have been considerable in one of the towns, though as weapons in the woods they were a species of arms seldom employed, never indeed unless it might be in some officer of Europe, who visited the colonies as many were wont to do, so much impressed with the superiority of the uses of London as to fancy they were not to be laid aside on the frontiers of America. What occurred in the discovery of these weapons will appear in the succeeding chapter. Again, you have to remember, our author is an old showman, and he is pretty much creating the literary world that he is mastering. He is mastering it while he creates it, all the while teaching a young culture how to think about itself. So I want to stress over and over again, we can forgive him his bumptiousness. He is a bit of a boob, and we can not only forgive him for it, we can love him for it. We can love him for it. He's going to drag this out. We are not done with this chest, but we found two silver pistols. So, and of course, the really resonant note here, this chapter has that wonderful moment. These three young people, these three young friends, just playing dress up, and also, I don't know if you noticed, sincere compliments going back and forth. There's nothing to prove here. There's no one listening. There's no advantage to be got. It's just people appreciating each other. Sincere compliments, just going in all directions. It's in its own way a quiet, touching human scene. It has a resonant moment, of course. This offhand mention that, what's this you say? Your father has one particular gun that is absolutely superb. We get a mention of it and then it's gone. Once you've been through the book several times, you'll perk up when you get to that. But mainly it's that. With our author throwing in a little bit of tension. There's not real tension in opening a chest. There's a little bit of tension. He reminds you that the enemy is watching and that this could get violent at any minute by having the two men occasionally check the lake and the woods. That's not much, but for a chapter like this, that's all you can hope for. So we'll wrap it up for here. Sorry about the length, but our author is long-winded. So is our reader, and I'll be back. Thank you.